Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Inquiry. I'm racing to catch up on some episodes because there's been a bit of a break in our series. So today, I'd like to introduce a super erudite, super incisive guest that I spoke to several days ago on the show. But with China looming over everyone's minds, this conversation, of course, seems ever germane. Shyam Saran is a career diplomat and he's been the Foreign Secretary of India. He recently wrote a book called How China Sees India, which traces the historic interactions, relations, and misconceptions between the two countries. It also examines the reasons that are driving China and Xi Jinping's belligerent expansionism. Given India's anxiety about its inscrutable neighbor, this conversation was full of fascinating insights. Do watch. Shyam, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Inquiry. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me, Shoma. Thank you very much.
So, Shyam, you've written a really timely book, which is How Does China See India and the Rest of the World? And you know Mandarin, you've served in China several times. You're an expert on China. And at this point, the entire world is focused on understanding China. So it's really timely, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you about it. So I wanted to start, Shyam, your book takes in the entire sweep of Chinese history, but there's a very interesting assertion you make there, which is that, all nations really try to live out a story that they tell of themselves, and you said both China and India have very different stories of how they see themselves. So can you start with China? What is the central idea of how China sees itself?
China sees itself, as I have mentioned in the book, as historically being a center of very advanced culture and civilization. That it had along its periphery lesser countries, lesser cultures and civilizations, and it was always very clear that China, in fact, was always a country deferred to, always a country whose clout was recognized by the countries around it, and therefore for many centuries there was essentially a kind of a Chinese ordered universe, certainly in Asia, if not elsewhere. And that this is in some way a continuous history. So if you go back to the past, from there you can draw a straight line to the present, really, where there is a kind of a evolution, a kind of advancement of this center of culture and civilization to what it is today as one of the, admittedly, one of the most important, second largest economy of the world, probably the second most powerful military power in the world. So all the jagged edges in between in that history, all the periods of fragmentation, periods of consolidation have in a sense been smoothed over in depicting this straight line. So this is why I say that this is a story which tries to give the impression that China has always been a kind of central power, and it's like a natural place for it. And what is happening today is China is literally reoccupying that central place.
Right. So, interestingly, Shyam, there's a lot of this revisionist history or trying to reclaim place in history that's driving a lot of countries. America, of course, has a shorter history, but there's that whole make America great again. Russia is also trying to reclaim its, power like as a Soviet and its prehistory. So now when you say that, when you come to India, what do you think is the story we've told of ourselves? And, is it a strong one? Is it a effective one? And do you think that we're also in the process of transiting into some other story?
So in China, the interesting thing is that this particular narrative that I'm talking about has not really been very much contested domestically. This is something which is regarded as quite self-evident in a sense to most Chinese. In the case of India, perhaps the history is somewhat more contested. So there is a history of India, say, for example, articulated by somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru, that, India has been through a very tumultuous period of history, in the sense that it has had periods of consolidation, brilliant, centralized empires. You have had periods of fragmentation, where India has been broken up into smaller principalities. You have had a sense that this was a country which, unlike China, was throughout history very much open to the rest of the world. I have called India a crossroads culture. And why do I call it a crossroads culture? Because, we were really at the intersecting point of, say, the caravan routes from Central Asia. We were at the intersecting point of the ancient maritime routes for almost a couple of thousand years, both eastern reaches of the Indian Ocean as well as the western reaches of the Indian Ocean. You were open to invasions, migrations, traders coming, religious figures coming. So you have ended up with a very, very plural culture, with a complete ethnic mix-up in a sense. So the homogeneity which you see in a large part of China, that homogeneity is not there in India. So there have been narratives about Indian history which recognizes this, that actually, you see, through this rather tumultuous history, finally we have come to a point where we are probably one of the most diverse, one of the most plural countries in the world, and this very openness to the rest of the world has given a brilliance to Indian culture, and a kind of accommodative nature, assimilative nature of that culture, which perhaps other countries do not. And yet you have another narrative. I mean, if I may just in 2 sentences there, you have another narrative which you also see unfolding today, which is that there is a glorious past in the history, which is somehow sanitized of all those jagged edges again. And you say, what really is the destiny of India is to go back to that kind of a mythical past, a kind of a brilliant past, which we have somehow lost, mainly because, again, of the same, attacks and assaults from outside. Which narrative you actually adopt is going to be very critical for your future.
Right. So I'm going to come to, this thing that you said about India's past, of how we were actually the crossroad culture, whereas in the imagination, it's China that was the Silk Route, that was the center of trade, that's the kind of stereotype that there is. I'm going to come to that, but this point that you just made, so you're saying India is transiting into the desire by, say, the current government to create another more monolithic past, a more, centralized idea of India. But so we are in that state of transition. But let me ask you about so far how India has seen itself was as a plural, diverse, open, embracing country. But in the race for power, do you think that is a story that is less effective than, say, the China one, or has it proved to be a strong one?
So what works for China does not necessarily work for India. China has its own sort of cultural identity, a sense of itself. We have our own self, identity. And if you ask me, I believe that the greatest asset which India has is precisely its ability to handle immense diversity, its ability to accommodate plurality. Why do I say that? Because we are living today in a globalized world. And I also assert that despite the some setbacks to globalization, globalization is here to stay, because it's a creature of technological innovation, technological advancement.
Yeah.
I mean, just look at what happened during the pandemic, for example. That we had galloping globalization as far as the global domain was, the digital domain was concerned. So if you are looking at a more globalized world in the future, which are the cultures, which are the countries that are more likely to succeed in what is going to be a much more crowded space, a much more crowded planet? Those who have the ability to handle plurality may be better placed to handle that more globalized world. Maybe I'm wrong, but I certainly believe that plurality is actually India's strength. Many people believe it is not, but I certainly believe that actually this is your USP.
Actually, again, from my perspective, it's fascinating that two completely different experiments in nationality, nation creation, is sitting next to each other with the two of the largest populations in the world, And China, of course, is authoritarian. It's a one-party system. But we, in fact, have been a very stabilizing presence. And with this openness, we are still holding our own in the world. We are seen as a very substantive global player by all countries in the world now. And the fact that we've taken a different route to prominence and scale is something one would be proud of, rather than, as you said, to go the authoritarian route.
Absolutely, I agree with you, and as I have said in the book as well, we are an ambitious path. We want to have a bigger profile both regionally and globally, but in that pursuit of that objective, do you see China as the successful model? Unfortunately, a lot of people in India do. They see democracy as somehow limited, see our heterogeneity as somehow a liability. Not realizing that actually these are the great strengths that you have, which others don't have. And you can't be China because China is 96% fairly homogeneous. I have pointed out, the influence of the script, for example, in China and how it has been different in India. So we should recognize that our trajectories through history, yes, there are affinities, but there are also very big differences. And you should really live up to what has given you strength through the years, rather than look outside and see, what works, because I don't think that is the way to go.
That's not the psyche of our people or the DNA.
No.
Or actually, if you even go to the religions, the dominant religions of the subcontinent, which were birthed here, even the DNA of those religions is not monolithic, So,
so it is very important, Shoma, to realize that in India, the state historically did not see religion as a threat. It could allow different religious faiths, creeds to really coexist side by side. In China, there was always a very careful watch kept over religion because it could threaten the state. So you saw the most recent example of that was, for example, Falun Gong. Their ability to mobilize large numbers of Chinese, and they could actually go and sit outside the forbidden city. That was scary for the Chinese. In a way that religion, different faiths in India, has not really been regarded by the state as somehow, a great threat to it. And I would hope that we, in fact, also don't head into that direction.
So, Shyam, the other interesting point you make is that China has this view of itself as being the central power and authority in the Asian continent, that it was the kingdom under heaven ruling over all, and that the West actually played into this narrative, in the way history was written. And so it's kind of got solidified in everyone's mind and imagination.
Including our own.
Including India's. So we are double colonized by, the years of British rule, and then this assumption that China was the power. So, but you're saying that actually is a faulty narrative, and one can write about that, but China sees itself like that. But you're saying that actually it wasn't that. It wasn't the central magnet of all trade routes, and that in many ways India was, So can you talk of some of the positive revisions, or let's say putting spotlight on India and history that we do need? Right now, sadly, a lot of it is driven by revenge or a sense of wound. But if it was to put the spotlight on aspects of Indian history and strengths that we have forgotten, what would you pick?
So, as I point out in the book, that if China had a kind of a mandala of statecraft, it was that we are the advanced central civilization and others pay homage to us, learn from us in a sense. There was one country which did not fall into that mandala, and that was India. Why? Because India was seen as the source of, say, Buddhism, which came to India through either the caravan routes or through the maritime routes.
Sorry, China, you're saying? Buddhism came to China.
Buddhism came to China from India.
Yeah.
And you had lots of Chinese monks coming to India to learn at the feet of the great masters in Nalanda or Vikramshila. They came back to China and, painted a picture of India as very advanced civilization, a knowledge center of the world. It was described in many Chinese texts as the Western paradise. That was the kind of image of India that was there in China. And it was not only a Chinese political or literary elite which was influenced by this, but more importantly, it eventually spread amongst the people of China. So Buddhism became a very popular religion in a sense, and people in China then realized and became aware that there was this country, perhaps a little far away, but which was, or it was even perhaps even superior to China in terms of its culture and advancement.
Right.
So there was, if you take that as a prevailing kind of sentiment for many hundreds of years in China, you don't see the imprint of China on India. So in the book, I argue that there is very little curiosity in India about China.
Yeah.
So there has been an imprint of India on China, but not the other way around. Secondly, if you are talking about, which country had a greater impact on the countries in Asia, certainly I think India would be given that role, because starting from the old days of Hindu influence, then Buddhism again to Southeast Asia, the maritime connections between, say, the Malabar coast, the Coromandel coast with Southeast Asia, and even with China, as well as towards the west, as I said, whether it was the Persian Gulf or it was Eastern African coastline. India was, in fact, in a real sense, really at the heart of these ancient exchanges which were taking place, philosophical exchanges of ideas, as well as goods and maritime trade, for example. So in that sense, if you are asking, how can India claim to be in the spotlight? I think it has eminent reason to be proud of the fact, not that it dominated the countries on its periphery, but I think you can certainly take pride in the fact that India provided that kind of a cultural spark, which led to an efflorescence of culture in many of these countries. So you go to Indonesia, where I served as ambassador, you will see the colors and echoes of India virtually everywhere you go. But it is not India.
Yeah.
It has Indonesian genius in it. But yes, the spark may have come from India. So that's the difference.
So actually, it's very interesting, because mostly when one tries to revisit Indian history, there's a kind of, say, amongst the liberals, there's an anxiety about it, because it's always done in a way which then becomes combative of the Muslim period, and it's as though then you sort of communalize your modern present because you're revisiting the Indian history and past and the glorious Indian past. So there's always a kind of negative anxiety around going back to history. But I was just asking you this question because actually there's space for a lot of positive revisiting of history, repositioning India actually for its glory and taking pride in that in a very legitimate and a productive way. When you were just saying this, actually a good way of quantifying it.
Yeah. So the first thing that we need to do is to purge our mind of the British division of our history into Hindu, Muslim, British, as if these were sort of separate compartments.
Yeah.
And, each had a different sort of existence and its influence. That's not really correct, because if you take just the maritime trade. Now, this maritime trade was, in India at least, if you take the Coromandel coast or the Malabar coast, was as much in the hands of maybe Hindus as it was in the hands of the Muslims. How did so many Arab communities come and settle down on the Indian coast? Because they were part of that trading network.
Yeah.
Much of the culture which developed, for example, in the Deccan, much of that culture is a very composite culture. It's very difficult to say, oh, this is the Hindu strand, this is the Muslim strand. These are all mixed up together. I think the problem arises when you try to start, unpacking this into precisely as I said, there is a Hindu box, there is a Muslim box, and there is a British box. It was certainly not like that in history. It was a much more, as I said, we are a mixed up people. Our cultures are very mixed up. And I think not only recognizing that, but celebrating that.
Yeah.
It has given us a richness of culture which very few countries have.
Yeah, when you were talking about this comparison between China and India, it's interesting that now China is about 14% of global trade. When the British came, going with Shashi Tharoor's data point, India was 23% of the global trade. So that actually kind of reminds one how robust and flourishing and prosperous India was before the 300 years of British
and over a very long period of time. So you go back to the Roman Empire and the kind of trade relations which existed, for example, between India and the Roman Empire. And by the way, that was also connected to the Chinese goods trade, because a lot of Chinese silk used to come down the Central Asian caravan routes to the ports on the western coast of India, Broach, for example, which in the old days used to be known as Barigaza. This was a transit point for a lot of Chinese goods going to the Roman Empire.
Right.
So there were interconnections that perhaps are not entirely obvious to us. It is when I was researching for this book that I realized how dense actually those connections were in the ancient days.
So it would be wonderful actually if this was a mukabla between a country that puts its dominance in being a closed country, yes, with global trade, but psychologically closed to the rest of the world, and India asserting its power in the world through being an open, plural, diverse, very self-confident economy and culture, So if we stick with that,
potentially that is the way it should be. But I would caution you in terms of, we should not completely generalize that China was always a closed country, because I have pointed out in the book that, this is a more complex history.
Of course.
There are periods of consolidation, there are periods of fragmentation, there are periods when China is ruled by, alien people, alien ethnic groups. During the Mongol Empire, for example, the Chinese Empire was part and parcel of this huge Eurasian empire, which the Mongols had set up, and which really gave such a huge fillip to the to trade amongst the countries, not only in Central Asia, but for example in the Gulf and going to the Mediterranean. So there were periods also where China itself was, relatively speaking, open, had a much more cosmopolitan culture, And there were periods when it was much more closed. But it is certainly true that in terms of this ebb and flow, India, comparatively speaking, had a much more sustained openness to the rest of the world than perhaps China. But I just wanted to caution that it is not as if China was always like a closed book. Not quite.
No, it's the narrative that it. I mean, you said that, but actually, I mean, just to add one little thing, that the Hampi, the Vijayanagar kingdom, which is seen as the pinnacle of Hinduism, the Hindu kingdoms. When you go to the ruins, it's fascinating because all the friezes have Chinese, Turkish, you see so many influences, and clearly there were very strong influences there because they're all over the walls, and as traders and as dancers and musicians, you can see all that there. So you really see that confluence of culture in Hampi and Vijayanagar, so
right.
important to remind us. So I was just saying that if we were revisiting history in a way which of course puts the torchlight back on our grandeur and our gloriousness, because you can draw pride from it in a positive way rather than in a revengeful way. But so now coming back to China, Shyam, by and large, the world feels that China is inscrutable, and that it is difficult to understand this country. So you now understand it pretty well. What are the big sort of milestones? It had its century of humiliation. What is the driving idea that propelled China into becoming the powerful force that it is today? What were the 2 or 3 really big strands, milestone watersheds that changed China?
So one important aspect that we should keep in mind is that whether it was Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, or it was Chiang Kai-shek, all of them had the same idea that China was, in fact, one of the great powers of the world. It may be currently sort of somewhat weak, but its destiny was always as one of the great powers of the world, and regaining what it had, even if it was somewhat imagined, regaining the central kind of a position that it occupied, both in Asia and in the world. So that particular dream, what Xi Jinping talks about, that particular dream has not really changed very much. What has changed? I think what has changed is, okay, how do we go about realizing this dream? So you had a period which was also very similar to India, where you had this Western challenge, technologically more advanced, militarily more powerful, very strong naval forces that enabled them to rule the seas. How do we deal with this challenge? So one was dealing with this challenge meant that you go back to the roots of your own culture, because you are a superior civilization, you are a superior culture, and therefore it is because you have abandoned those values that you have become weak. Therefore, the way in order to get back your strength is find the inspiration from your own ancient culture and civilization. Of course, that was not possible. So how do you modernize while remaining true to your value system? So in India also, if you remember, we went through the same kind of phase, isn't it? That you had to adopt Western knowledge and technology in order to be able to confront the West. So China went through that as well. So what has been the recent history of China is, okay, what is the instrumentality through which we achieved the China dream? So you had the revolutionary answer to it, Mao Zedong, which did not work, spectacularly failed. And then you had Deng Xiaoping say, no, the way to actually modernize and become a great country again is to really have a sense of humility, a sense of modesty, learn from those who have advanced science, technology. The biggest focus was human resources. So when the Cultural Revolution ended, it was the Chinese state which was sending thousands and thousands of Chinese students to learn in the universities of the West and Japan. because they recognize that brain power is the most important thing. You know? And this is what, from the time that China's reform and opening up began in 1978, this has actually been the story. That, China has been very open in absorbing, all the knowledge and technology from abroad. And it has now come to a point where it feels that it can be, relatively speaking, more autonomous as a part. So I have pointed out in the book that throughout history, you will see an invariable pattern that, you have centers of advanced knowledge and technology in any given period. And those who are trying to aspire to that kind of status then have to learn from those most advanced sectors.
But Shyam, just to cut in here, that, so it's true, Mao tried to wipe the slate clean, and in fact cut off China from its history, took it in a completely different path. It's culturally, psychologically, all of that. That didn't work. Deng opened it up, and then the one governing impulse became to be wealthy, and you write a very interesting phrase. You said, when you went back to China, after the modernization, after Deng opened it up, it was like the Wild West, it was just lucre, money, money, money everywhere. And then, of course, now under Xi Jinping, it's become a desire for global power and dominance and globalization in a different way, What's interesting, and I wanted to understand from that, Shyam, from you, is that America, India, a lot of these countries, even Europe, the desire for global conversation or dominance is not just through military power or trade. It's also a lot of culture, So the West, of course, dominates our mind through cinema and through products and music. But China, for all its ambition and its rich cultural history, seems to have no cultural imprint anywhere in the world, even in the countries that it has huge investments in. There's no cultural exporting of itself. Why is that?
Well, I think you are in the early stages yet. So China has set up, for example, these Confucius centers all across the world, which is essentially to try and promote Chinese language, Chinese culture. But the most important thing is that China is today saying, look at us, learn from us, because we have made a success of ourselves. While the others have struggled to develop economically. Here is China, which has actually managed to do this. And therefore, one of the major changes that took place in the way China relates to the world was a speech made by Xi Jinping at the previous conference, where he said that China can be, or the Chinese experience can be, a template to be followed by other countries who are aspiring to develop their countries and to bring about an improvement in the living standards of their people, which was not the case before. Earlier, they were saying each country should follow its own path. There is no single route to development. So maybe China's experience is unique, but today it is not unique. It is something that can actually serve as a model for others. So in that sense, don't underestimate the influence that this is having, not in the West maybe, which dominates media, which dominates international discourse, but certainly as far as a large constituency of developing countries are concerned, the Chinese influence is actually increasing. Maybe
that of course, but I was just saying that even the way it's projecting itself is only as economic transformation. There's no cultural component to that. It's just that they were the factory of the world, they were cheap labor, it's authoritarian, it's centralized decision making. Everyone has awe for its long-term planning. You quote, for instance, Deng saying, let's lie low, observe, be patient, don't show our strengths until we're ready to reveal. So, it seems to always have this kind of long-term national planning, almost tactical planning. But I was just wondering why there's no cultural assertion of itself. It's only an economic assertion.
I don't think that there is no cultural assertion. It is just this, that they are still sort of feeling their way around how to bring this about. For example, today you have Chinese international TV channel where you have English. So they have realized that unless they use English as a medium to reach out, influence will be somewhat limited. So there is a tremendous emphasis now on actually having English language channels, having, for example, in China, you know that very large number of Indian students have been going to study medicine. Many of the universities have for foreign students, at least in the initial stages, use English as a medium of instruction before they start learning some Chinese. So there is an effort to try and, establish a bigger presence. Public diplomacy is something which they have adopted in a very big way. Maybe not yet as successful as they might have imagined, but that is because of ideological problems, because of that insularity. And a sense of anxiety when dealing with the outside world.
Yeah. I guess how can you have a cultural conversation if most sources of information are blocked in China?
Absolutely, quite right. So, you had a greater Chinese influence during that limited period of liberalization, where, there was a tremendous development of modern art, for example, using Chinese tradition, but also not being afraid to step out into very, very new kind of fields. Take, for example, Ai Weiwei.
Yeah.
The very famous painter and sculptor. So you had people like that, and who had a tremendous influence, not just in China, but outside as well. So I don't think it is for lack of trying, but there are limitations because of China's own, historical sort of anxiety about engaging with the rest of the world. And it is also ideological to a very large extent.
So let me then pull you into the current situation. Shyam, you've again used a very interesting phrase, which is that there was a time when the India-China story was hyphenated and people saw both as the rising economies. China, of course, has outstripped India completely in economic terms. But you said that China had a very low view of India, and that now it's like India is a receding picture in its rearview mirror, So why do you say that? Like, why is it just the economic asymmetry and the military asymmetry? Why is India dropped off the China mirror? And then why, how do we interpret its assertions on the border, this whole Galwan, Doklam, Pangong, all of this? Do you foresee it as a pre-step to actual military expansion, or is it just a humiliation of India? How do you read that?
So one, I think we should recognize that the Chinese perception of India is somewhat ambivalent. It is not as if it is all dark. It is ambivalent because there is an acknowledgement that there was a time when India was, that center of culture and civilization, and that it is one of the two major civilizational states in Asia. So there is that awareness. There is also, even today, there is sometimes an element of surprise in China when, for example, they see the success of India's space program. And they say, well, how did this country, how did this happen? Or India's emergence as an IT power. They recognize that, well, this is also something which we had not perhaps factored in. So there is more ambivalence rather than, I would say, complete dismissal of India as any kind of a credible, power. But it is also true that when China is relating to other countries, its sense of what the balance of power is extremely important. So this is why I have given the example of, say, 2003, 2007, where I point out that even though there was that asymmetry of power between India and China, India was not anywhere in the same league. But the difference was that India was growing at a very rapid rate, about 9% to 10% per annum. It was seen as actually shrinking the gap with China. If you see the discourse at that time, that India is probably going to be the next China in that sense. So there was also a recognition by China that even though this country is behind us, it is catching up very fast. And in terms of dealing with the rest of the world, adjusting existing global regimes, the rule-based order as the West says, or in shaping regimes which are currently under negotiation, like say on climate change or on multilateral trade issues. If India and China were able to work together, then they would achieve more in terms of safeguarding their interests than if they were working by themselves. So this is.
You're saying this is an understanding China had, or is it something that you?
No, China had. Right. Because they were ready to work together with us. I mean, for example, I was doing climate change, negotiations, and I was working very closely with the Chinese. And during that period, they were quite ready to defer to India's leadership, allow India to, take the leadership role. So there was a different perception of India as an emerging economy. The first sort of period of the BRICS. Or in India being a very important, participant in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the BRICS Development Bank. So India had a different kind of a role in Chinese eyes. Then you have the global financial and economic crisis coming in 2007, 2008. And that changes the whole geopolitical equation. On the one hand, the gap between China and the US starts shrinking. China is recovered quickly. It's growing at the rate of 6.5% to 7% per annum. The United States of America, Western Europe are in the doldrums. China looks at India and sees that India is no longer growing at the same rate as it was. The gap between India and China is increasing. So this changed the kind of a Chinese assessment of what the global geopolitical situation was. So it became, in terms of sensitivity to India's concerns, say at the border, China's sense was, why should we, accommodate India in the manner that we were doing before? Because in any case, it is not in the same league. So that change in the balance of power is something which is very important when you look at why did Galwan happen? Why is it that protocols which had worked in the past and worked rather well for nearly 40 years, why they did not work at this time? And this time, I think it was precisely, why do we need to accommodate? If there are problems arising at the border, what we need to do is to, give them a solid rap on the knuckles. And they should know that we are more. Yeah. So, and there also, when I mentioned to you that sometimes there is a surprise, there was also a surprise at the Indian reaction. That we managed to get a very large number of forces at the border. We may not be able to reverse the gains which we have made, but I think it would be fair to say that they cannot make further ingress in many of these areas. And they also keep trying to suggest that, why don't we put this aside and get on with the rest of our relationship? Not recognizing that, the whole mood in the country has changed. It is very difficult to do that kind of compartmentalization. So there is, in terms of the current relationship, again, I think it is very important to understand that, how we understand China and its way of thinking and how the Chinese look at how India thinks, there is a big gap. Our understanding, frankly speaking, of China is very limited. It is very much security oriented. It's very much military oriented. We do not look at the larger picture, which may explain some of the things that are happening, day-to-day things which are happening. Which is why, in a sense, I wrote this book, that we need to be able to understand each other much better. Both have stereotyped images of each other.
Right. But Shyam, what you just said, so if you're looking at these milestones, so after that century of humiliation, then there was Mao. He tried a really radical experiment which didn't work well for China, destituted it. And then, there was this whole push towards modernization and opening up and all that. And then you're saying comes 2008, which is a big watershed because China began to see that both America and India are in decline or badly impacted. And then now we come to the next big watershed, which is the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand how you see this. You've made a point that you think China has miscalculated because Russia is going to lose this war. And I wanted to ask you about why you say that, because just in military terms, it's more, after the initial push, Russia is seeming to begin to dominate. And I'm beginning to see a lot of global commentary that Ukraine should now sue for peace, which would really mean the whole Western bloc is suing for peace. So one is that, why are you saying that Russia will anyway lose the war and China has made a mistake? And second, has the Ukraine-Russia war, which is the first big sort of Western war that's happened, shown that because the economies have become so interlinked, that it's very difficult for any diplomatic, that rule-based order, whether it's NATO or the UN or even America, to really do anything without full-blown war, they are hamstrung because anything you want to do, your own economies are impacted. So first question is, why do you say Russia is going to lose? And second, how do you see the whole new emerging global order play out?
So I would like to put the Russia-Ukraine war again in a somewhat larger context, because will make it perhaps easier for you to understand why perhaps this may have happened. So if you look at much of the Chinese commentary or Russian commentary on the eve of the Ukraine war, you will see consistently a judgment that the West, and in particular the United States of America, are in terminal decline. Why? Because if you see the performance of the West European countries during the pandemic compared to, how China was able to, at least in the initial stages, able to handle this. If you see the dystopian kind of reaction in the United States with 1 million or more people who had died, if you see the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, again, nobody can deny that it did not seem to
shambolic and shameful.
And constantly this judgment coming that even if the United States of America is still the world's most powerful country, it has lost the will to fight. This is what the judgment after Afghanistan. And this is a common judgment. This is where the convergence of judgments come in between China and Russia. So this judgment leads to the conclusion that this is a moment of opportunity. So if we want to put in place or begin to put in place a kind of a more Eurasian order, which is dominated by Russia and China, this may be the good opportunity to do it. And this is reflected, as I have pointed out in the book, in a very important speech made by Xi Jinping, where he says that we are in the midst of changes which have been unseen in a century. So this is transformation. Second, that the balance of power has changed, and it has changed irreversibly. That means there is no going back. So if you take that judgment, that it is our moment of opportunity, then if Russia was to try and push its interests in Europe by threatening Ukraine, and if it did not give in, it would be a matter of a few days before Ukraine would collapse and cry uncle, in a sense. By the way, this was not only the judgment of the Russians and the Chinese, it was a judgment of the Western countries as well, that Ukraine will not really be able to hold out very long. Now, a number of things have happened which have gone beyond the anticipation of others, that Ukrainians are actually fighting, that you have a comedian who's actually turned out to be, at least in international discourse, is coming out like a hero It's a David versus Goliath kind of a war taking place. So there have been a lot of unexpected developments, which has led to, okay, our assessments didn't work out. So what do we do now? Now, secondly, with regard to Ukraine itself, why do I say that Russia has already lost? For two reasons. One is, even if it wins more battles, not the war, but more battles, as it is, where you just pointed out, if it leaves Ukraine as a complete rubble, does that count as victory? You have earned the enmity of millions of people with whom you have actually had very, very dense, ethnic and kinship connections for probably generations.
But Shyam, there I'll push you back on your assessment, because I mean, if you look at the war, the Second World War, America decimated Japan, or Germany, or, similarly, I mean, lots was brought to rubble, was nuked, and countries have risen up again through cooperation or through dominance or through aid, or, I mean, literally. So I'm not sure that I would.
I would accept your argument if Russia was a substantial economic power. Russia is a declining power. Its GDP is coming down, it's lower than India's. It is only resource-based wealth and income. So the ability of Russia to bring about, after decimating Ukraine, to do this, put some ointment and try to bring back a more positive relationship, even if it happens in the future, not for a very long time to come. It's certainly not going to happen in a hurry. Secondly, if the Russian aim was that, it is being marginalized from the European security architecture, that, its interests are not being taken into account by the Western Europeans and by the Americans. Now, if having a greater role and being a stakeholder in the emerging European security architecture was one of the objectives, the opposite has been achieved. Because now you have Sweden and Finland also in NATO, both of which share borders with Russia.
Yeah, and their military spending, their budgets, everything has gone up.
And even if the unity amongst the Western countries, you may say, will not last very long, the fact is that it has changed materially the whole security environment in the continent. And thirdly, Russia, in a sense, has been completely unplugged from the global system. You see suddenly again that even if the West is a declining economic power, its dominance of the world's financial system is unmatched. And therefore, its ability to weaponize that system and cause immense damage to others is very much intact. And which is why China is so worried, for the future.
So China, in fact, is sitting on the fence. It's not overtly. It's kind of again in a watch and wait sort of mode. Even on the Russia-Ukrainian situation, it's not really aligned very overtly.
It cannot not support Russia. Let me put it this way, because too much has been invested in that. But when it comes to how do we deal with, say, the economic consequences, it has been very careful. I think I have pointed out, it's been very careful not to violate those sanctions on Russia, which may expose itself to secondary sanctions. So where it is low risk, they are supporting Russia. Where it is high risk, for example, in terms of financial transaction, they have been very careful. Take, for example, the Russian civilian air fleet, which is very large, mainly made up of Boeing and Airbus aircraft. Now, in China, there is a huge infrastructure to support their own civilian air fleet. So they have joint ventures, making spares, components, maintenance facilities. The Russians did reach out to them to ask for help in keeping their own fleet going, and the Chinese refused. and quite publicly. So there is their reaction. Rhetorically, they are supportive, but when it comes to actual nuts and bolts, they have to be a little more careful. But I would say that on balance, I would say that Chinese support for Russia continues to be very strong. And I do not think that you will see much of a change in that respect.
Right. We're going to run out of time very soon, Shyam. I'm just going to ask, I wanted your interpretation of how India is reacting in this situation. But before that, I asked you but has the Russian-Ukrainian war also showed up the West and the America for its own limitations, because the sanctions are not being that impactful. There's a blowback, there's recession blooming, there's an energy crisis. So that's what I was asking you, that this economic interlinkage has also shown up America and the West in its own sort of paralysis of power as well.
There is pain all around. So nobody has escaped suffering and pain as a result of what has happened in Ukraine. It's a question of, what is the balance between, having to put up with this pain and the geopolitical or the political, objective that you have in mind. I think the difference is that if you see much of the polling in most of the West European countries, you see a willingness to put up with some of the economic pain and hardship in order to try and punish Russia. Now, you may say this may not last very long, because as the pain increases, maybe they will also change their mind. But at this point of time, there is no doubt that by and large, there is a fairly strong consensus within Western Europe that even if it means some pain for us, we should support Ukraine, and we should. I
think, let me ask you a more pointed question, Shyam. That what is your reading? Of course, is going to be predictive, but what's going to, when all this shakes out, how do you see everyone standing? Do you think China is going to feel more emboldened to invade Taiwan or not? Do you see that America will be more diminished? And if China becomes more dominant, what is if you were just to look at the tea leaves, how do you foresee?
So, the problem with predicting is that there are too many balls in play in a sense. Why do I say that? Because it is now quite unpredictable what happens in US domestic politics.
Yeah.
2 years later, what will happen if Trump comes back? All the calculations we are making, all the assessments, predictions we are making would go out of the window. Secondly, with regard to China, it is difficult to make a prediction about how may they act, because it has been also seen in the past that China has sometimes reacted to increased vulnerability by being more aggressive rather than being less aggressive. So it is even likely that if the sense of anxiety and sense of insecurity increases, and that is in some way exacerbated by what is happening domestically inside China. Don't forget, we have a very important party congress coming up, where Xi Jinping will be seeking perhaps, presidency for life. So it's a very, very vulnerable moment in a sense for him politically within China. And sometimes domestic politics and external posture do get connected. So it is very difficult to say, will China react to a sense of vulnerability by in fact advancing the timing of making some move on Taiwan, or whether it would step back. Rationally, you would say it should step back, but sometimes that is not what how China reacts. So that is why I'm not going to make a definitive judgment in that sense. The third is that even with respect to China's current external posture, you see a certain degree of pushback against China. So whether it is Africa or whether it is even, take even our own neighborhood, where we were, facing pressures from China virtually in each and every, neighboring country, that seems to have diminished somewhat. not only because China's ability to deliver has diminished, but because countries in the region themselves have become rather wary of the Chinese connection. How this will play out as we go forward, it is difficult to say, but my own sense is, if I have to just gut feeling, I would say that I do believe that there is increasingly a realization in China that in going in for this no limits partnership, no forbidden areas partnership with Russia, that they have made against calculation. So this is not only my judgment. I see a lot of Chinese writing where this suggestion is being made that, maybe we made a mistake and we are going to be pulled down by what the Russians have, started, determining our agenda, and that is not a good place for us to be in. There are also moves to try and see whether they can at least dampen that sense of competition with the US. Now, you have seen recently there have been long conversations between the Chinese state councillor and his, US counterpart. There is likely to be maybe another virtual summit between Biden and Xi Jinping. All that gives me a sense that the Chinese are not feeling very comfortable in the situation they find themselves in, and they are trying to therefore see how they can, expand their space somewhat. If I may, just 1 minute, if you see, for example, the setback that they received in the Pacific Islands, where it was almost expected by people that they would be able to sign this agreement, very ambitious agreement, which would essentially be like a kind of a security partnership between China and the Pacific Island states. That did not come about. I mean, it was a bit embarrassing because something that was anticipated had to be given up. So my sense is that there is this pushback. And then there is a certain degree of reassessment going on in China. And we will probably see somewhat less aggressive a posture by China in the coming days than we have seen in the past. But that's a gut feeling.
Right. So sadly, Shyam, 2 quick questions. One is that how do you see India's response to the Russia-Ukraine war and the diplomatic positions that we have been taking? India is pushing a much more large foreign policy agenda. We seem to have multiple interest-based relationships, often at odds with each other. Is that an interesting new development? How do you read India's foreign policy moves and reaction to Russia or Ukraine?
There is a considerable degree of continuity, to my mind, with regard to India's responses to this situation. The position that India took, for example, at the United Nations in not voting either for or against and making its views known more through explanations of vote. If I go back to, say, 10 years, if I was, say, in a similar position to decide what should be our reaction, I doubt whether my reaction would be any different. Because I think all things considered, this was perhaps the right stance to take. Partly because of very real limitations that we face, given the legacy relationship that we have with Russia. And secondly, I think there is some merit in taking the position that, merely indulging in condemnatory statements does not really advance any likelihood of a resolution. And therefore, why should India be put in that position? Secondly, with regard to the various kinds of interest-based coalitions that you're talking about, again, this is not something new. I think we have position that we have taken over the last, say, maybe 15, 20 years is that India's interests today are somewhat wide-ranging. They are more complex than they were perhaps in the past. And therefore, limited partnerships may not allow us to achieve all the objectives that we have. And which is the rationale for looking at different partnerships to achieve different kinds of objectives. So we don't see, say, a contradiction in our being part of the Quad and also being at the same time part of, say, the SU. Because what we are seeing, maybe some people may say that this is being too clever by half, but the fact is that there are certain things that we want to do, say, with respect to Central Asia, in which case the SU is helpful. Because it's not only, okay, it's dominated by China, but there are other countries as well. And therefore, if you have a forum where you are able to reach out to them, this is of some advantage to us, as the Quad is with regard to some other interests that we have. So I think in carrying forward that kind of approach, this government may want to suggest that it is making a huge departure from the past, and this is a completely different foreign policy that India is following. If you dig a little deeper, you will find rhetoric may be somewhat different. The reality remains somewhat the same, which is because that reality has not really changed very much over the last 10, 15 years.
Right. So that was the last thing that I was asking you, that what do you think is going to be the shakeout of this? That is there interesting new landscape coming up where, you've just said how both China is a little bit diminished, and post-COVID now, and its focus there. Russia is diminished, America is diminished, Europe, yes, the NATO expansion is growing and there's a renewed sense of Europe's play, but it's not in a position to be a really big, political dominance or economic dominance. So do you see an interesting new landscape where that era of superpowers is over and we're really entering a multipolar world? Because I found it very interesting that America is not pushing back that much on India as either, whether on human rights, whether on its position on Ukraine, and because we are seen as, the safer bet against China, or even Pakistan has lost favor with US. So it's a very interesting new landscape. Do you think we are heading for a very multi-voiced new world without superpowers, or is that a misreading?
We don't know whether we are going to finally end up with a multipolar world. What we can certainly say is that there is the tremendous churn which is taking place. And this is opening up, as you said, many possibilities. Now, whether those possibilities are orienting us towards a more multipolar kind of a system, or whether it may eventually settle down to, say, a duopoly, a US-China kind of a diarchy, which comes to some understanding about managing the world, even while competing with one another. Something similar, not quite the same, but something similar.
That's what's been there all this while. Yeah.
But that is a possibility. We should not preclude that possibility. What I certainly see is that in this churn, where number of possibilities have opened up, there are also possibilities which have opened up for India. Now, you pointed out to one element of that. You said that the United States of America is willing to give India quite a long rope in a sense.
Yeah.
Why is it willing to give you a long rope? Because you are seen as being one of the critical components of how this current churn will play out. So are you in a position to take advantage of that? Because I see foreign policy as an instrument of bringing about a transformation of India. That should be its objective. So I see this particular point of time where your room for maneuver has expanded somewhat, and various major powers are interested in having you more on their side rather than on the other side. It gives you a possibility of leveraging that for your own transformation. So with respect to, for example, our relations with the Western countries, I have pointed out that even though these are countries which are relatively speaking in decline, I don't think that decline will stop.
Yeah.
You see, because there are structural factors behind it. But they continue to be the repositories of very sophisticated technologies. They continue to be sources of capital. And by the way, they also continue to be major markets of the world still. Diminishing, but they are still some of the largest markets in the world. So for India to be able to utilize a much more benign relationship with these centers of power for its own transformation is something that really is what you should be looking at. Whether you can orient your foreign policy and your leadership in a direction that allows you to bring about that transformation, because it is a rare moment in history where a large number of major powers have a stake in India's success. Maybe that the reasons for wanting India to succeed may be very pedestrian, but the fact is that there is this moment where quite a number of countries actually want you to succeed. So why not try and take advantage of that? That's what I would say.
That's a good moment to end on, Shyam. Like a blunt question, are we making the right steps in this situation?
Well, I think there is a awareness, certainly, that yes, this is a moment of possibility for India. Much of what is required to give it a concrete shape are domestic policies. So again, I would repeat that if you have a politics which is one of division, which is one of communal kind of politics which we see sometimes, if we devalue the very strengths that we have, as I mentioned to you, with regard to our ability to handle diversity, then
and being democratic. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the reason why democracy is important for India is because it is the right instrument for handling plurality. So if we recognize that these are actually strengths that we have, which we can leverage, and very importantly, are you ready to make the somewhat difficult structural reforms that you need on the economic side to enable you to leverage what is possible for you from these, more positive partnerships that you have established? Are you ready to, for example, really make it congenial for, say, Japanese business, American business, European business to actually see merit in and see advantage in coming and literally making India the platform for their own economic, advancement? This is something which will require leadership, which is able to sense not only that there is possibility, but is able to translate that into actual reforms. You have a leadership which is very strong. Nobody can doubt that you have a prime minister who perhaps wields far greater power than many prime ministers India have. So potentially he has the possibility of actually spearheading those kind of reforms and changes. Whether he will do that and whether the political environment in India, social environment in India will enable that to happen, that remains a question mark.
We'll end on that, Shyam. I'm very tempted to continue this because I want to probe what are the reforms that you suggest, but that's going to spill us even beyond the hour we've been chatting. Yeah. But well, thank you.
We'll do this again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shyam.
Thank you very much. Thank you.